Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it a few minutes while folks come in from the waiting room, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, well, it looks like our numbers are stabled off, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Louise Bedsworth, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at Berkeley Law. I'm really happy to have you here today as part of our Lunch and Learn series. CLEE is a research center within the law school where we bring together interdisciplinary teams really focused on how we can implement and make climate and environmental policies work to achieve our climate goals. We do our work at the intersection of law, policy, and training and partnerships and convening to advance real-world solutions to some of our most vexing problems. As part of our Lunch and Learn series, we bring people together to share new findings, to talk about emergent policy topics, and really just to engage in dialogue around a lot of these issues. We work regularly with government, business, and the nonprofit sector throughout all of our work. Our Lunch and Learn series is made possible through the support of our partners, Wilson Sonsini, Oric, Hanson Bridget, and Water and Power Law Group. So today's topic is a very timely one where we're going to be discussing Project 2025 and its implications for climate and environmental policies. Project 2025 is a political initiative that's been led by the Heritage Foundation with the input of over 100 conservative organizations, in which they've developed a playbook, which is 922 pages long, looking at ways to rework government, working across the executive branch, defense, general welfare, the economy, and independent regulatory agencies. Because addressing climate and environmental policies is by nature very systemic and touches on many aspects of government, the Project 2025 playbook has broad implications for federal climate and environmental policies, and then how that plays down into the subnational level as well as into our international space. The report touches on energy and environment in many ways because there are vast implications for the administrative state and the ability of agencies and departments to implement policies that address environmental and climate issues. There are chapters dedicated to the agencies that affect climate and energy, including the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of the Interior, HUD, the Department of Transportation, and others. But the project playbook also digs into personnel policies, and including the role of career staff and other aspects of government that really will affect the ability of government to have the expertise, knowledge, and capacity to address some of these challenging issues. Importantly, Project 2025 is not endorsed by either candidate running for president, but we've chosen to look into Project 2025 because of the implications of what it could mean for meeting our energy, climate, and environmental goals at all levels of government. Our mission at CLEE is to help move policy into action and develop practical and effective policy solutions. And it's clear that many of the topics included in the Project 2025 playbook will have implications for the ability to do that. So we've been drawing on legal expertise across CLEE and the law school, but also from our partners to just really dig in, read through the playbook, and look at various aspects to understand what it could mean. In August of this year, we had one of our emeritus board members, Marty Mattis, developed a guide to excerpts from the Project 2025 playbook, and that has been posted on our website along with some annotations. And then most recently, we had another colleague, Robert Urim, who's been looking at implications of personnel policy proposals within Project 2025 and what that could mean for energy and environmental policy. We're going to continue to build out these analyses, and we'll be adding them to our website and welcome you to subscribe to our listserv and to check out when we are updating that material. So today we have two experts from Berkeley Law who are here to share their perspectives on Project 2025. We'll have some discussion and then we'll open it up for questions for everyone attending. So I would encourage you, as you're going along, please put your questions in the Q&A and we will get to as many as we're able to today. So we'll start. We have Dan Farber, who is the Sato Professor of Law at Berkeley Law, and he is also the Faculty Director of CLEE. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a life member of the American Law Institute and an accomplished scholar of environmental and constitutional law. And then following Dan, we'll hear from Ken Alex, who is the Director of Project Climate, an initiative at CLEE that Ken developed to help take promising climate solutions and bring them to scale and action. Prior to joining CLEE, Ken was Senior Climate Advisor to Governor Jerry Brown, where he was also the Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and prior to that led the Environment Section at the California Attorney General's Office. So with that, I will turn it over to Dan to kick us off, and then we'll turn to Ken, and then we'll go to some questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Louise. I thought I would start by saying a little bit more about why Project 2025 matters. A Republican candidate who would be the most likely to implement these ideas has not only not endorsed them, but has kind of denounced Project 2025 and tried to distance himself. So why do we still care? I think one reason is that Project 2025 is mostly not a source of like original ideas. These are ideas that are floating around in the sort of conservative think tank world and among conservative politicians, and are likely to have broad influence whether or not any particular candidate endorses them. And one example of that is that these ideas are echoed by a group I think hardly anyone has heard of at this point, called the America First Policy Institute. And that institute actually has close ties to the Republican candidate. The head of the institute, Brooke Rollins, someone else who's not a household name but could become one, is helping lead the Trump transition team and has been talked about pretty publicly as a potential White House chief of staff. And in addition, some of these proposals are not just, academic or theoretical ideas. They got tryouts in the 2017 to 2021 presidential term. And then with Biden coming in, they were reversed pretty quickly, but there's every reason to think that they could pop up again. So, as Louise said, this is a really long report. And actually, that's one of the things that's important about it is it really goes into great detail. It's not just the sort of, general anti-regulatory rhetoric that you hear from politicians. It really drills down in a very comprehensive way in a lot of different areas of government activity, and the environment is one of the key areas. So there are lots and lots of proposals in there. In thinking about which ones are important for us, I think there are three factors. One is the degree of environmental harm. Some of these factors have at least more immediate consequences for the environment than others. Others might be more of a long-term problem. Ease of implementation. Some of the proposals would require Congress to pass substantive legislation like amending the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. We all know how hard it is to get that kind of legislation through Congress. So those, while they would be really major important changes, are also less likely. On the other hand, executive orders are very easy to implement. All the president has to do is sign them. Agency actions can take longer because there are rulemaking procedures, and so that can be more difficult. And Congress, although it has trouble passing substantive legislation, has some shortcuts for passing budget rules. So spending cuts, for example, might be a lot easier to implement. And then the final issue is irreversibility. Of course, any cutback in environmental protection is probably going to mean some harm to the environment or to public health. But in most cases, the harm can be reversed in a later administration, or at least it can be halted in a later administration, and we can go back to having stronger protection. But some changes are irreversible. Once greenhouse gases go up in the atmosphere, they're there for, a couple 300 years. Institutional changes can also be very durable and very hard to reverse. And I'll actually talk about that in just a second. And those tend to be kind of sleepers because, although they have huge effects, they're not something that the public necessarily understands clearly in terms of the environmental impacts. So Schedule F notably calls for some drastic institutional changes. Some of them involve expanding presidential powers. Louise mentioned Schedule F, which is a plan to allow the firing of many government experts and experienced civil servants, people who are not quite at the top level, but just below that, possibly as many as 50,000. Once those people are gone, yeah, we can start trying to rehire, but that's going to be a time-consuming process. And we're not going to get back the knowledge base and experience that we've lost. Something else that's not in Project 2025 itself, but is supported by the authors in other places and also supported by Donald Trump, is expanding the president's impoundment power. This would allow the president to unilaterally cut programs or slash funding without having to get Congress's agreement. Obviously, that would have a huge effect. Once you slash that funding, once you lay off staff, once you do all the other things that involves, you just can't wave a wand, restore the funding, and expect you're immediately going to be back where you were. In particular, either through impoundment or through congressional action, the Project 2025 calls for some really big changes in the government agencies and programs. It proposes breaking up NOAA, the agency that's in charge of oceans and does a lot of atmospheric science and climate change work, privatizing the Weather Service, which is now part of NOAA, and turning it over, I don't know, whether it's the Weather Channel or whoever, getting rid of something called the Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS, which is a big database about the risks of toxic chemicals, eliminating EPA's Environmental Justice Office and its Compliance Office, and abolishing several Energy Department clean energy offices, basically trying to take DOE out of the clean energy business entirely. There's also a series of assaults on clean energy regulations. Basically, if you've heard of a clean energy regulation, Project 2025 calls for getting rid of it, along with some you haven't heard of. So, for example, eliminating California's regulation of greenhouse gases from vehicles. Basically eliminating any effort to expand electric vehicles and de-emphasizing the environmental effects of vehicle emissions by letting the Department of Transportation, not EPA, set the federal limits on emissions. The idea there is that EPA could maybe regulate stuff like leaks from air conditioning systems, but the whole combustion cycle, all that carbon dioxide, that would be with the Department of Transportation, which has less expertise and less interest in climate change issues. eliminating eliminating government support for public transit. And then in terms of the power sector, Project 2025 takes a dim view of efforts to expand transmission nationally, and calls for number one, giving that back to the states, which tend to favor short projects that their utilities want to do, and putting the cost of new transmission more on renewable generators, which would, of course, discourage renewables. Calls for cutting the prices paid for renewables in electricity markets, and it calls for leaving control of CO2 limits on existing power plants, mostly to the states. So our view is that we shouldn't wait till the wolf is at the door. We need to start figuring out the policy and legal issues now, and that's what we're doing. We're doing that specifically with an eye to environmental stuff at CLEE. There's another new center at Berkeley called the Edley Center, which is trying to look at sort of broader implications of some of these changes for democracy. One of the things we can do is give, and I think this is an important function CLEE serves, giving journalists, lawyers, and policymakers a ready source of information. When some of these things happen, it's going to be very quick breaking news. People are going to be looking around for guidance about just exactly what's happening here and what does it mean. We can think about implications for California and possible responses. California has a lot of resources and a lot of different ways of taking action. May be difficult for California to do much about federal personnel policy, but there are a lot of these other issues where the state would have standing to sue or might be able to take other kinds of countermeasures. So with all that as an introduction, let me turn it over to Ken.
Thanks, Dan. That in the 5 minutes I have, I'm sure I'll resolve all of these issues. Yeah. So one thing that CLEE is doing, as Louise mentioned, we have now on our website about 40 pages of excerpts from the document, from the 922 pages, reflecting the actions proposed around environment and climate. In addition, we're doing a monograph series. The first paper in that series is also on our website, and that deals with what Dan just talked about with Schedule F, the implications for civil service employees, thousands of them potentially under the proposal. That is particularly interesting and timely because it is based primarily on an executive order that was issued at the end of the first Trump administration that set out much of the proposal that's now in the Schedule F discussion in Project 2025. I think it would not be a stretch to expect that executive order to be renewed should there be a second Trump administration. So it's very timely to start thinking about what legal avenues there might be and what the implications of the proposal are. And for people who are interested, really suggest taking a look at that monograph paper that we've just put into the chat. So a couple of other things. There's so many things in here, and Dan listed quite a number of them. I'm going to list a few more. What we'd like to think about is what are some of the avenues that we have to get ready, to think about what legal challenges there might be, whether there's a Harris administration or a Trump administration. There certainly will be follow-up to some of the proposals in Project 2025, some of which will be through the courts and things like the major question doctrine that the Supreme Court has provided in the last term. So one of the things that was certainly prevalent in the Trump administration but didn't come to full fruition is the notion of a unitary executive, really a radical notion of unitary executive, where the president has complete control of everything in the executive branch, including things like the Fed, including different bodies that are presumed right now to have a certain amount of independence. The theory embedded in Project 2025 is that this is a unitary system that the president has complete control over and cannot be subject to second guessing, even by the courts. So I suspect that we'll see that in some form. I mentioned the potentially replacing thousands of civil service with political appointees. That has implications for Republican and Democratic administrations going forward, if that's to be the new system. That means that every 4 or 8 years, you're going to have a really radical alteration of government and a loss of expertise, as Dan said. There's a very prevalent theme of climate change denial that runs through almost all of the proposals, some of it quite explicit and very explicitly favoring fossil fuels in the name of energy independence. Dan mentioned the cut to research, abolishing NOAA, getting rid of satellite data. There's a sense here also, sort of like the Trump administration's response to data for COVID, that if you don't have the data, then it doesn't exist. There is a proposal to get rid of all references to climate change, ending at least aspects of the California waiver under the Clean Air Act, expanding oil drilling on BLM lands, explicitly calling for repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, promoting fossil fuels with allies, reversing the EPA finding that CO2 is harmful to human health, ending national flood insurance program, and of course, an end to the social costs of carbon evaluation. As Dan said, many of these are through regulation that will take a little longer. To the extent that they can do it by executive order, that will be high on the list. There's also a proposal to ban cumulative impact evaluation under NEPA, which would basically end consideration of climate change under environmental review. I'll mention 2 more things, and then there's so much here we can stop and get to some questions. USAID would change its focus from promoting renewables and talking about climate change to focus on fossil fuels. And then finally, the USDA would focus solely on food production with no discussion or relationship to environmental benefits at all, and would not discuss climate change. So pretty clear element of denial given the relationship of food production and climate as we know. So I think I'll stop there, Louise, and hand it back over to you for wherever we're going next.
Great. Great. Well, thank you both so much. I think that was really helpful to just sort of help wade through a lot of material that is in the document. So we'll go ahead and turn to some questions. Definitely encourage folks to put your questions in the Q&A function, and we will get to as many as we're able to. But I will start while we wait for folks to put their questions in with one question, which I think, Dan, you mentioned, the major questions doctrine, that issue that it came up last year, but then also we had the Loper-Bright decision that I think many of us saw as also a major setback for administrative agencies to be able to exercise their expertise to affect environmental regulation and policymaking. How do you see for either of you, see what's in Project 2025 intersecting with and sort of either building on or taking that further? So how do you see those interacting with some of the other court decisions and such that have also been, cutting at the authority of agencies?
Let me start, and then obviously Ken may have more to add. I think Loper-Bright is actually a two-edged sword here, because basically it makes it a little harder for agencies to do anything in either direction, right? So if the Trump administration wants to reinterpret a statute to cut back on regulation, before they could claim that the Chevron doctrine entitled that to deference, after Loper-Bright, we don't know exactly what Loper-Bright means, but it clearly retrenches on deference to agencies, and it will make it maybe that much harder for the Trump administration to make that argument. We don't, as I said, the exact parameters of Loper-Bright and its implications for judicial review are still not clear. Lower courts are confused, but to the extent that it limits agency discretion, I think that's as much a problem for Trump as it would be for Biden, or nearly as much. I think the only reason it's not quite as much is that the conservative Supreme Court, may still have a tendency to favor deregulation over regulation. But that's kind of independent, I think, of this change. One of the big questions about the major question doctrine, there must be a way I could avoid repeating that word, is whether it works both ways. The court has, in the most recent cases, only applied it in cases where the government was trying to expand regulatory authority. And to the extent that's true, then the major question doctrine just won't be an issue for the Trump administration. It's just another argument they can use to roll things back. On the other hand, some of the cases that the Supreme Court has relied on, as when it sort of paints the picture of where the major question came from, did involve deregulation. For example, one was an effort by the FCC to deregulate certain kinds of phone rates. And if it cuts both ways, then I think the Trump administration could also find themselves somewhat hampered in making some of these really big rules. I think there's a really good argument, for example, that Schedule F would be a major question and that it would fail under that doctrine. So I think the bad news about these decisions is that they hamper agencies from doing good things, but the possible good news is that they may hamper agencies from doing bad things as well.
Yeah, I have a couple of things to add. I basically agree with what Dan just laid out. People forget that the original Chevron doctrine that Loper-Bright disbanded was really brought by environmentalists opposing an action in the Reagan administration. And so without the Chevron doctrine, the chances that regulation from the Reagan administration would have survived were less. So it does, Loper-Bright potentially cuts both ways. I think the major question doctrine is going to be used more as to attack affirmative actions. And I think of something like Massachusetts versus EPA, in which the different Supreme Court, it's almost like the good old days of the Supreme Court, hard to believe, but Mass versus EPA, a 5-4 decision that found that EPA could regulate greenhouse gases as pollutants under the Clean Air Act. Well, I wonder if this court would rule differently if they had the opportunity. So I fear the major question doctrine somewhat more than I fear Loper-Bright.
Great. So there are a few questions coming in, so I'll turn to those, and I have more I can come back to if we have time. But I guess with the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law, other than repeal of those two items, what else does Project 2025 propose with regards to those programs, and what leeway would the executive branch have, to implement those changes?
I'll let Ken go first this time.
That's going to be a somewhat difficult question to answer because it'll depend on the context of the change. So as Dan said, some of this can be done through budget. And if there's full control of government by Republicans, then I suspect a lot of those changes will be done through budget. The regulatory changes Dan said is a more fraught process, and there are existing requirements in place. If it's about a repeal of particular regulatory action, then we have to think about the Congressional Review Act. Those would have to be regulations that were adopted towards the end of the Biden administration. Congress can review those quite quickly. So it's a fairly factual, specific base set of questions, I think. And there is quite a bit that can be done by executive order, at least in the short term. Executive orders can be reversed, but those orders apply to the administration as the administration goes forward and can be challenged in court for undermining the will of Congress. And then we get back to the issues that we just discussed as to whether some of those actions create a major question issue, among other things.
Yeah, I agree with Ken, and I agree most fervently with his opening statement that this gets really complicated to talk about in detail. Because when we're talking about spending and tax legislation, we're talking about areas where the changes are often like very subtle, very technical. I've read a bunch, or I tried to read a bunch about like what the Treasury was doing with various tax credits. It's really hard to figure out, if you're not a tax person, exactly what's going on there. I think getting rid of those tax regulations would take time because they're complicated and they took time to adopt. Could be done. And on the spending side, again, there could be tweaking of regulations governing the spending, but probably the easiest thing to do would be to just sort of slow walk all the spending and then try to get Congress to at least put it on hold, if not repeal. I'm moderately optimistic about the IRA itself, at least about many of the provisions surviving, because there are strong Republican constituencies for some of them. 18 members of the Republican members of the House wrote Speaker Johnson to indicate that they thought repealing the IRA would be a bad idea. It's not because they've suddenly gotten religion about climate, it's because there are a bunch of new jobs and investments in their districts that are at stake. So I think Johnson himself said a little bit later that modifying the IRA was going to take a scalpel rather than a bludgeon. That would be the first time that the House Republicans have used anything but a bludgeon in quite a while. So it'll be interesting to see how well they do that. But I think that's a sort of concession that they can't just wipe the whole slate clean. They can't. There are things I would especially worry about: the credits for buying electric vehicles, which tend to be a target of Republicans and have difficult sledding with the public because people think that's only for the upper 1% that can afford to buy fancy Teslas and other kinds of EVs. So that one might be at stake. I think as Project 2025 shows, however, the sort of deregulatory forces have maybe gotten smarter or at least more knowledgeable about a lot of these little ins and outs. So I think the risk for these seemingly inconsequential technical tweaks that actually cause a lot of trouble is probably higher now than it was in the first Trump administration, when basically they knew less about what they were doing.
And maybe just a quick follow on to that, because I don't know that actually Project 2025 will directly have much to do with this specifically, but if you have a sense on the unspent dollars under the IRA or the bipartisan infrastructure law, could they be claimed and subject to budget cuts?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or at least funds that haven't. I mean, I think the line is maybe not whether they've been spent, but whether they've been committed. I think once the government signs a grant or a contract or something, it is possible to undo it, but it becomes more difficult. But yeah, I think they'll make a big effort to either cut back that funding, or apply, at least cut it back as to new projects, or if they can't get an agreement on that, maybe an agreement to just pause funding a year at a time, which they've done before with programs. So I think the Biden people are well aware of that, and they're doing their best to get as much of that money out the door as they can.
Yeah, so the only thing I would say is that in theory, it would require some congressional action. There are different forms of congressional action. It could be done through budget, it could be a clawback, it could be an end of a program, etc. But having said that, and I will say this was true even in state government, the executive has, as Dan suggested earlier, different mechanisms that they can slow walk funding, they can deny certain things, they can keep employment, the people who run the programs, that can keep those positions empty. So there are ways to really undo the spending, even if it's been approved.
Great. Another question, and I don't know that we have the answer to this, but just in case you all have been tracking it, which is, do you have a sense of how widely Project 2025 is understood among voters, and especially swing voters, which I think we know is a pretty small number of voters out there these days, but if you guys have seen polling or other types of analysis around that?
The only polling I've seen has been for people who have heard of Project 2025 that they hate it. So how many people have heard of it? I think there's some, vaguely a sense that people have heard something about Project 2025. Whether they associate it with a particular candidate or not is unclear, and how many have actually heard of it, I don't know. But if they have, they don't like it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And now how much they know about it is also another question. And I think some of the reasons why it's unpopular relate to, completely different issues like abortion related policies. But yeah, there's a reason why Trump disavowed it. And it wasn't because he read the 920 pages, which I imagine nobody has actually done. It's because it was playing very badly with the voters. So swing voters in particular, swing voters tend to be people who are pretty disengaged. You would like to think they're people who have intensely studied all the issues and haven't quite decided, but it tends to be people who, I don't know, just found out there's a presidential election and now they're not sure what to do. Or, people who just don't ordinarily pay attention to politics or public policy issues. And whether this is something that has sort of penetrated into that group, I have no idea, and I haven't seen any data about that. But the Democrats keep pushing Project 2025 and trying to tie it with Trump. So that suggests that they do think that it has some leverage among voters.
And how do you think Project 2025 would affect some of our international environmental commitments, and sort of how far off track do you think it could take us in terms of meeting our goals generally?
I'll take a start at that. Yeah, this is the really unfortunate part of this. One thing that we know at CLEE, Center for Law, Energy, and Environment, is the home of the California-China Climate Institute. And one thing that we have seen and heard is that China is waiting to see the outcome of the U.S. election for their own actions on climate. And the expectation is if Trump is elected, that China will pull back to some extent. There's a limit to that because I think they also see economic advantage in a lot of the new technology. But the overall policies, including emission reductions and goals and setting and things like that, I think quite clearly if Project 2025 and some of the ideas in that are instituted, that we'll see a worldwide impact. I mentioned that the part of Project 2025 is to promote fossil fuels with allies, extends liquefied natural gas, and exports potentially of fossil fuels from the U.S. It is, of course, the United States satellites, modeling, research, data. The U.S. continues to be one of the world leaders on climate research. Places like UC Berkeley will continue, but as those dollars dry up, as places like NREL and Lawrence Berkeley Labs and others receive less funding, that is going to have a very significant impact on information and knowledge. And if the U.S. is not leading and following through on its own commitments, everything from emissions to resilience, that is profoundly troubling. I have to say, having worked on this issue for the last 35 years, it's extremely depressing.
Just to add a couple of things. One basic point is that the president has much more leeway in foreign policy than domestic policy, and correspondingly can either accomplish more or cause a lot more damage with very few checks. Most foreign policy things generally can't be taken to court. If they require spending money, then Congress may have to approve the money, although presidents have some ways of getting around some of those restrictions. But for example, I would be very surprised if the U.S. if Trump were to win. I'd be very surprised if he failed to pull us out of the Paris Agreement within the first 2 weeks. I think he's done it before. He's already, he doesn't need to do any more thinking about the issue. I think the first time around, it was a little bit harder choice for him. So I think we're out of that again. I think that it is going to have significant international repercussions. And I think our efforts to affirmatively promote the use of fossil fuels abroad, would also take us further away. So you asked how far off track we would get, and sort of continuing that metaphor, I think it'd be a train wreck.
So then how do you think California and other states, but particularly California, because of our special status under the Clean Air Act and our ability to, push especially on emissions for vehicles, can California continue to serve in that role should there be these rollbacks, as talked about under Project 2025? And can I know you mentioned, I think we alluded to at one point, one of you, the sort of waiver process. Do you think that will get taken further, under a Project 2025 scenario than has been sort of as we've experienced in the past? And would that sort of limit California's ability to take the role that it has played as this sort of as a leader and being able to continue pushing forward on those commitments?
Yeah, so we'll do the positive piece first, which is California's role. I will say in the first Trump administration, whereas Dan noted, the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Agreement, California became a significant focal point of international climate effort, and in part because countries around the world needed to have the U.S. participation. And one way they found to do that was to at least have the state of California, as the state is fond of saying, the fourth, fifth, or sixth largest economy in the world, and obviously one that has done quite a lot on climate, to have partnerships and discussions. And there's also a technology piece given Silicon Valley and some of the relationships there. I would expect that to be replicated. Having said that, California is a tenth of the US and does not have an international budget. And so it cannot fully replicate what the US can do, and that would be a huge loss. But it will no doubt expand its efforts. On the waiver issue, you may recall even the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, tried to cut back California's waiver authority. Just for anybody who's not aware of it, under the Clean Air Act, California can set its own emissions for tailpipe emissions, for example, which can then be adopted by other states. And there tend to be about 20 states that tend to adopt California emission requirements, which tend to be stricter than the US standards. And usually those stricter standards are the ones that the automakers comply with because they don't want to have two different sets of markets. There is a requirement for the waiver that California get approval from the federal government when they set a different standard. The Bush administration attempted to deny a waiver. That started litigation, but then the Obama administration reversed that. We saw the same thing with the Trump administration, followed by the Biden administration. I would assume if Project 2025 is followed, that will be squarely in the crosshairs.
I think that's right, particularly as relates to standards for greenhouse gases. I think there's more reluctance to attack other parts of the California waiver. I'm sure there are people in the California government right now who are thinking about, how to defend against that move and what other steps could be taken to deal with vehicle emissions, because transportation is now the largest source of greenhouse gases in the US in California. And if we can't address that, then we're in real trouble. So if this does come to pass, people have to fight back and also get really creative and try to come up with workarounds.
So we've talked a lot about the rollbacks and proposals within Project 2025. Are there alternatives that are proposed, or is the idea that there would be no more environmental regulations, or would they look different? Is it talking about more market-based approaches or things like, so I'm just, what are there alternatives that are proposed in addition to the rollbacks?
Yeah, that's a fair question. There are a couple of answers to that. One is, yes, as the question implies, it would move to a compliance model. And by that, the idea would be that EPA would offer some compliance assistance to companies that have to deal with environmental regulations, and that enforcement would be a lot less. I will say, in my 25 years in the Attorney General's office, we went through times where that was the emphasis, both in the state and at the federal level. And in each instance, that went on for a while, and then there were major environmental catastrophes, which led to change back to an enforcement model. But and there's a fair amount of research and literature on the relation of enforcement and compliance. So this has been tried before. It's not new. There are certainly benefits to compliance assistance, and EPA and state agencies try to do both. But this would clearly change the emphasis. The other kind of theme that comes through, other than a very significant reduction in staffing and an end to almost all of the science advisory groups connected to US EPA, is really a free market approach that I don't really, maybe Dan, you have a better sense of how that might work than I do. I'm not quite sure in reading it how that comes to life, but there's a sense that regulations are secondary to how the market handles environmental issues.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the Project 2025, at least in the environmental area, is basically about reducing environmental protection measures as being either too burdensome or unnecessary, and not that much thought to what would replace them, except sort of hand waving about how industry really wants to be clean and, you know, so forth. In the area of the power industry and renewable energy, I think there's a little bit more there. The general thrust of that, you know, California, well, really nationally, the FERC has deregulated wholesale power markets basically, and allowed market, you know, and therefore allowed markets to function to set prices. And we've seen a big national move away from having integrated utilities where the utility owns everything from the generator to the customer's meter. And the general thrust of Project 2025's discussion is that things were much better with integrated utilities, which is pretty much the system that's been retained throughout most of the South, right? Where there's been very, you know, which has been backward on renewable energy. And I think you would certainly, I think, see moves to either intervene in energy markets so that they produced more favorable results for fossil fuels, or maybe even try to move away from markets to a situation where utilities would be in control of more. So, you know, I think you can see hints at least of a reform agenda there, but it's not a very appealing one from my point of view. I think with public lands, which I did not look, it's a little less in my area and I didn't look at it as carefully. Again, I think a general move toward pro-development policies as opposed to preservation, and to pro-fossil fuels as opposed to renewables. They're very negative about offshore wind, for example. I think also, this goes back to the Reagan years, sort of a message that the federal government, you know, shouldn't be controlling so much of the nation's lands, and that states should have a much bigger role in making these decisions. Although, unlike some earlier proposals, it doesn't really call for sort of, massive divesting of federal ownership. But it does, but I do think you would find more instances in which the federal government was basically deferring to what states want to do on public lands.
Well, I know we
Except
only,
California, which obviously they wouldn't want to defer to.
yeah. Well, we only have 2 minutes left, and so I thought I would maybe just close it out with one quick question that get your thoughts from each of you, which is, I think right now, and even the nature of our conversation, this Project 2025 is coming up in the context of one of the closest presidential elections that we've ever experienced. That said, on November, the second week of November, once we've resolved the election, Project 2025 is not going away, and I think it will be here whether we have President Harris or President Trump. So what would you all suggest as sort of the most important thing to be keeping an eye on and looking for as these proposals are out there, and sort of the pathways that could be taken for them to be implemented?
Well,
So we want everyone to vote, and then what?
Okay. So if it's Harris who wins, which I hope we will know in the second week of November, but I can think of scenarios where we might not. Obviously, there's not going to be a lot of administrative implementation of Project 2025, although I suppose there might be a few things where they decide that it would make sense to sort of bend a little in that direction. So we'd really, at least in the short run, be looking at efforts to implement some of these ideas either through litigation or through Congress if the Republicans control Congress, or even control just one branch. But to some extent, Project 2025 would be sort of waiting at the wings for the next election, if nothing else, because these are ideas that have been around a while. They're not going to go away because of one election. Obviously, if the election goes in favor of Trump, some of what happens will depend on what happens in Congress. Not only whether the odds makers think that the Republicans are likely to control the Senate, but the margin could make a big difference because it affects the amount of influence that people like Murkowski and Collins have in Congress. Control of the House would make a really big difference. If Trump has both houses of Congress, he can clearly do more, especially on budget matters. If the Democrats were to gain control of the House or hold on to control of the Senate, that would constrain him considerably and push him more exclusively in the direction of using administrative and means and executive orders. So, but clearly, I think a lot of these ideas would be top of the agenda, either in Congress or administratively, depending on just how things were to play out.
So the only thing I'll add is that I think regardless of who wins, we're going to see very active use of the legal system. And I think the lower courts, because these things will take time to work through for the most part, and the Supreme Court has been taking fewer and fewer cases, which has some advantages at the moment, will be pretty important, and it will take some years to work some of these things through. So I think we really need to do some serious evaluation of these legal theories, and the nice thing here is it's a bit of a blueprint. As Dan said at the outset, it's pretty detailed. And so I think we should be thinking very seriously about what responses and what affirmative actions might be possible.
Which, if I can put in a plug, is just what CLEE is trying to do.
True.
Right?
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate both of your perspectives, and also to our partners, Robert, Marty, and others who have been helping us look into this and sort of dig through all of this work. And we'll continue to post papers in our monograph series and host these conversations. And so invite you all to follow along with us. But thank you all so much, and hope everyone has a great weekend.